One of the most important cities of the ancient world was Rome. The Roman Empire played a vital role in the spread of civilization in Europe. The greatness of that civilization came from some very basic infrastructure: the aqueducts for bringing water into the city, the roads for transportation of goods and people, and the drains for moving wastewater out of the city. The biggest reason why it was possible to build all those infrastructure was taxes. The common people would have to pay taxes in the form of gold or grains, and the kings would use those taxes for many things: to wage wars, to build infrastructure, and unfortunately sometimes for their own luxury. And the people who did not pay taxes, there were punishments for them. They were put into prisons, their lands or grains were seized, and maybe some of them were thrown into stadiums to fight as gladiators. If we fast forward roughly 2000 years in the future, we are in 2024. The world has vastly changed. We have come from paved roads to expressways, from aqueducts to massive dams, and from living as king's subjects to becoming citizens with rights and owning the nation. But when it comes to taxes, almost nothing has changed. You pay 30% of your income to the government or you go to jail. So today we're going to discuss whether we should continue paying taxes happily or we should revolt. Namaste and welcome to Retail Investing. This is a luxury apartment in Mumbai. It has all the facilities a resident would need and also some facilities no one would need. And this is a slum. It does not even have the basic facilities needed for a decent standard of living. And ironically, these living spaces are next to each other. The inequality is very much visible to the eye. But looking at the data can give us a much better understanding of the situation. So according to a working paper by the World Inequality Lab, India's wealth inequality in the last 100 years has gone up so much that it has been called the billionaire Raj. There are already more than 200 billionaires in India according to Forbes. And some of them, like Mukesh Ambani and Gautam Adani, have net worth close to $100 billion. In stark contrast, the per capita GDP adjusted for purchasing power parity is approximately $10,000. So yes, there is big inequality. Now what is being suggested by some experts on how to deal with this inequality is quite obvious. Impose more taxes on the rich and distribute it among the people. Now to understand whether that could work or not, we need to understand a few things about taxes and government spending. Let's go back to ancient times once again. It was the largest empire in the subcontinent's history, and it became possible because of the wisdom of one man. That man was popularly known as Kautilya, and his wisdom was written down in the Arthashastra. And without much surprise, the Arthashastra talked about both taxes and government spending. There is mention of some of the responsibilities of the government that collects the taxes. The king was assigned the duty to provide for the orphan, the physically disabled, and the people who needed help, like pregnant women and their newborn babies. For certain groups, the concept of tax exemption was also there. It also prescribes punishment for people who hide their incomes. And in times of economic crises, the king was allowed to impose special taxes on the people. It was a full-fledged fiscal policy. 2,500 years in the future, in 2024, the principles of taxation and government spending remain quite similar, if not identical. So here we have some data from the Union Budget of the financial year 2023. So this is government spending. The total estimated expenditure for the financial year stood at 45 lakh crore rupees. And here are some of the largest expenses. 5.93 lakh crores was spent on defense, 2.7 lakh crores on roads and highways, and 2 lakh crores on food distribution. Spending money in these segments is crucial. For example, there is the National Food Security Act, under which food grains like rice, wheat and millets are provided at prices close to zero to more than 90 crore people. If this is not done, the survival of millions would be at risk. If no money is spent on transportation and highways, we cannot travel and goods and services won't reach our homes. And if defense funding is not done, the nation could get invaded and civilization would come to the brink of destruction, as it has happened in the past. Now as citizens, we need to understand where is all the money coming from. The government just cannot print an unlimited amount of money to fund all these spendings. There will be hyperinflation. So let's have a look at the incomes of the government. So here we have the monies received by the government. The revenues are broadly classified into tax revenues and non-tax revenues. And as we can see, the revenues coming from taxes is more than 10 times the non-tax revenues. Corporate taxes contributed the most. These are the taxes paid by companies like Reliance and the Adani group of companies, but not personally by their owners. The owners pay taxes separately on their incomes. Then the second and third largest contributors are GST and personal income tax, which are paid by individuals like us. By now, it's quite clear that the government does not have any money of its own. It is the people's money, mostly collected in the form of taxes. Number 1 is direct taxes. So whenever we pay a tax directly to the government and no one is in between, it is called a direct tax. Nothing is simpler than that. So the entity which imposes the tax is the same entity which collects the tax. Some examples are personal income tax, property tax, and corporate tax. Now a very important thing to understand here is a principle called the ability to pay. We have to pay income tax only if we have income. If there is no income, there is no income tax. And people with higher incomes pay higher taxes than those with lower incomes. Companies have to pay corporate taxes only if they make profits. So in case of direct taxes, when there is progress in income, there is also progress in the income tax amount. Hence, it's called a progressive tax. Indirect taxes, on the other hand, are a bit problematic. And I'm going to explain why in a moment. So these taxes are not collected directly by the government. They may be collected by manufacturers, wholesalers, or retailers and then sent to the government. No matter who collects them, they are ultimately paid by the consumer. Now the problem with indirect taxes is that the principle of ability to pay does not apply to them. It does not matter whether the person is rich, poor, or somewhere in the middle. The tax burden remains the same. So indirect taxes are like the genocide planned by Thanos, random, dispassionate, fair to rich and poor alike. Now these are called regressive taxes. Compared to the rich, people with lower incomes lose a bigger percentage of their disposable incomes to these taxes. The only way to avoid these taxes is to reduce consumption. But when overall consumption in an economy goes down, the economy cannot grow. Sometimes, to better understand a concept, we need to study its opposite concept. To understand light, we can study darkness. To understand courage, we can study fear. And to understand taxes, we can study debt. So debt is basically borrowing from the future. Governments borrow money to build many things: roads, bridges, and buildings. A bond is an instrument for such borrowing. There are bonds having 30-year maturity periods. That means future generations will have to pay the interest. Now taxes are the exact opposite of that. It's basically investing in the future. Whatever taxes the government collects can be used to build the same infrastructure but without debt. And in this case, the present generation pays for the future infrastructure. So policies on taxes and debt together create what is being called a fiscal policy. An economy growing with the help of taxes without taking much debt has a bright future, while an economy growing with heavy debt puts burden on future generations. There is an economic ratio called the tax to GDP ratio. We take the tax collections and divide it by the size of the GDP. The higher this number, the more a government can afford to spend on education, health, and infrastructure. India's overall tax to GDP ratio is at 11.6% of GDP. This number has grown in the last few years. If you look at the tax collection trends, the share of direct taxes, which are the progressive taxes, has been going up. And even among direct taxes, personal income tax has contributed more to this growth than corporate taxes. These are good signs. There has been increase in the number of taxpayers. Roughly 6.7% 30% of the population pays income tax now. There has also been a rise in the income levels, mainly in the higher income groups, which has increased the number of taxpayers. Now the monthly SIPs going into the mutual funds have been creating new records every month, and that attracts capital gains taxes. There is a group of 38 developed economies which form the OECD. These economies have very high tax to GDP ratios when compared to India and other developing economies. For the OECD countries, it's 34% of GDP, which means there is a heavy tax burden on the citizens. And because they pay heavy taxes, the economy is developed. It is like a double-edged sword. Now, if some influencer tries to convince you that you should relocate to a developed country for a better life, you need to remember that you will have to pay very heavy taxes there, and the influencer will earn commissions for smuggling you or referring you, whatever you want to call it. Now, it's true that there are places like Dubai where there are no taxes, but that is not going to last forever. To reduce their economic dependence on oil, they are attracting global businesses with a zero tax policy. Once enough investment comes in, there will be taxation. As a matter of fact, some forms of taxations are already being introduced in the region. It seems India has neither high taxes nor heavy debt. As a result, the growth is moderate but safe and stable. So what if the wealth of the ultra-rich like the Adanis and the Ambanis are taken away and distributed among the poor as suggested by some experts? Can that reduce inequality? Probably not. So here is the shareholding pattern of a typical Adani company. More than 72% of the shares are owned by the Adani family, and these shares make up most of the net worth of a billionaire like Mr. Gautam Adani. When the share prices fall, the net worth goes down, and when the share prices go up, the net worth skyrockets. So this whole net worth thing is mostly on paper. Whether it's 50 billion or 100 billion, these promoters are not selling. Can any democratic government force a billionaire to sell his shares for the sake of reducing inequality? Absolutely not, because that would be a violation of rights. In the world of entrepreneurship, wealth breeds more wealth. A billionaire with a net worth of $100 billion tries to reach $200 billion. And in the process, they expand their existing businesses, they start new businesses, or they innovate in their industries. All of that creates new jobs, adds to the national GDP, and their profits convert into corporate taxes for the government, which can be spent on the people, raising the overall standard of living. So taking away wealth from the billionaires can reduce inequality, but that would make everyone equally poor. No civilization was ever built without taxes. If we want to get rid of taxes, we have to start living in the jungle again. In the evolution of taxes of the last few thousand years, one remarkable thing has happened. In ancient societies like Rome, only the poor people had to pay taxes. They were called the peasants. The landlords and the aristocrats who collected the taxes were far richer than the peasants, but did not have to pay any tax. Today, the situation has reversed. There are different tax slabs, and people with higher incomes have to pay higher taxes. And for low-income groups, there are no taxes. For example, there is no tax on agricultural income in India, and more than 50% of the population earn their livelihood from agriculture. So if we want to live as citizens of a civilized country, we cannot cry about taxes. Being in the highest tax bracket is actually a privilege, but we should definitely take interest in knowing how the government spends the taxpayers' money. Are they even trying to solve the big problems the taxpayers face? Problems like financial frauds, which have become an absolute menace. Anybody can invest some money to buy people's stolen data, open a little call center, and then target the most vulnerable people, the elderly who don't have much understanding of technology, and then all their savings get stolen. Sometimes people in foreign locations are also targeted, which actually ruins our country's reputation. Why can't the government use taxpayers' money to track down these scammers? Taxpayers should ask questions like that.